Monica stepped into the bank with quiet determination. Her clothes were simple, modest, nothing to catch anyone's eye. In her hands, she clutched a small envelope, its contents more important than anything she had carried in a long time. It had taken her months to save up the money she was about to withdraw. Every penny had come from her long hours of hard work. She had sacrificed for this day, and now it was finally here. She approached the counter and quietly stood in line, waiting her turn, her heart pounding just a little. She had hoped to make the transaction as smooth as possible. Behind the counter, Mr. Sterling, the bank manager, noticed her immediately. His gaze flicked over her with a barely concealed look of disdain. He wrinkled his nose, eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't like the look of her, so plain, so unassuming. His judgment was quick, dismissing her as someone who didn't belong in his pristine bank. Monica finally reached the teller. She smiled politely, handing over the withdrawal slip she had filled out, and spoke softly. "I'd like to make a withdrawal, please." The teller glanced at the slip, hesitating for a moment. Monica had only asked for a small sum, but the teller's discomfort was clear. Before Monica could say another word, Mr. Sterling's voice rang out, dripping with condescension. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, stepping forward with a sneer. The teller, already uncomfortable, took a step back, clearly unsure of what to do. Mr. Sterling's presence was enough to intimidate anyone. Monica's hands clenched at her sides, but she remained silent. The tension in the air was palpable. She knew what was happening, the uncomfortable way they were treating her, yet she said nothing. Not yet. The injustice was obvious, and for everyone watching, it was clear this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something was wrong here, and it had everything to do with who Monica was, and how she was being treated simply because of her appearance. Mr. Sterling's gaze lingered on Monica, sweeping over her from head to toe. His smirk deepened as he scrutinized her appearance, his contempt obvious. His eyes were cold, dismissive, as if he had already decided that she didn't belong here, in this upscale, polished environment. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place?" Mr. Sterling's voice dripped with mockery, the words sharp and calculated. Monica remained calm, her composure unshaken. She had been through worse, much worse than the words of an arrogant man like this. "Yes," she replied softly but firmly. "I'd like to withdraw some money." Mr. Sterling scoffed, his face twisted into a sneer. He grabbed the withdrawal slip from her hand, his fingers touching it with exaggerated distaste, and read it over slowly, as if questioning her right to even hold such a document. "This account requires a minimum balance to withdraw funds," Mr. Sterling said, his voice heavy with condescension. Monica's expression remained unchanged. "I know. Please process my request," she said, her tone calm but unyielding. But Mr. Sterling didn't stop there. He let out a loud, mocking laugh, waving the withdrawal slip in the air for all to see. The customers nearby started to notice, their whispers spreading like wildfire through the bank. Some even chuckled at the spectacle, clearly enjoying the discomfort that had suddenly filled the air. "Oh, you know," Mr. Sterling said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "So tell me, where does a woman like you get this kind of money?" His words hit like a slap in the face. Monica could feel the heat rising in her chest, her blood boiling with anger, but she held herself together. She had spent her whole life learning to stand tall, even in the face of prejudice. She wasn't going to let this man win. The patrons continued to murmur among themselves, the sounds of their whispers cutting through the air. Monica's hands trembled slightly, but she refused to let them see it. She had worked hard for everything she had, everything that mattered, and she wasn't about to let anyone strip that away from her. "I don't think that's any of your business," she said, her voice still calm, still controlled. "Please do your job." For a brief moment, the bank seemed to hold its breath. The tension was thick, palpable. Mr. Sterling didn't appreciate being spoken to like that. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice so only Monica could hear, his words a venomous hiss. "We don't entertain scams here," he said, practically spitting the words out. "Take your little act somewhere else." Monica's heart sank as he reached forward, tearing the withdrawal slip in half with a mocking flourish. She had given him every opportunity to simply do his job, but now it was clear. He wasn't going to help her. He wasn't going to treat her like a human being. Without another word, he motioned to security, his eyes gleaming with a cruel satisfaction as he watched Monica's dignity crumble. Security guards appeared almost immediately, standing at attention as if they had been waiting for this moment. Monica's throat tightened, her chest felt heavy. She was being thrown out, humiliated in front of everyone, just because of the color of her skin, because of the judgment of one man who thought he was better than her. She stood there for a moment, holding back the tears that threatened to fall, refusing to let them see her break. She had been through too much to let this man destroy her spirit. She wasn't leaving without dignity, without fighting for what was right. But as the security guards moved toward her, she knew she had no choice. There was no reasoning with someone so entrenched in their racism, no arguing that would change his mind. The whole room seemed to be watching now, and Monica could feel their eyes on her. She was a woman who had worked hard for everything she had, but here, in this moment, she was treated like she didn't belong. The injustice of it was suffocating. Mr. Sterling leaned back, his posture relaxed as he observed the scene, his face smug, satisfied in his small victory over someone he considered less than himself. The crowd had gone quiet, but the whispers of judgment still lingered in the air, stinging Monica's pride. She refused to let them see her crumble, but the truth of the matter was clear. She was being thrown out, just like so many others who had been treated the same way before her. They were nothing but invisible to people like Mr. Sterling. To him, she was just another problem, another person who didn't belong in his world. Monica turned to leave, her head held high despite the humiliation. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. She wasn't going to give Mr. Sterling or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing her lose hope. But inside, she was already thinking, one day, this man will regret what he's done. Karma has a way of catching up with people like him, and Monica would be there to see it. Monica clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, but she didn't argue. She knew there was no point. The fight was not worth losing her composure. She silently picked up the torn withdrawal slip, her eyes lingering on the shreds of paper in her hands. She had hoped for dignity, for fairness, but that wasn't the reality she was facing today. Without a word, she nodded toward the bank manager, who still stood there, smirking at his small triumph. Without hesitation, she turned and walked out of the bank. As she passed through the doors, she felt the weight of the stares from the customers behind her. Some were sympathetic, others indifferent, but she couldn't allow herself to get caught up in the moment. She had to move on. Inside the bank, Mr. Sterling chuckled to himself, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression on his face. His day had been made. He had successfully removed what he considered to be a problem, a disruptive customer. He felt a sense of power, a sense of control. Keeping scammers out, he thought. Doing his job. The thought filled him with a false sense of pride. He sipped his coffee, savoring the warmth and the comfort of knowing that his world was still in order. He had handled the situation perfectly. The woman was nothing, just another person who thought they could disrupt the smooth functioning of his bank. Just as he took another sip of his coffee, his assistant rushed in, her face pale and her eyes wide with panic. She looked flustered, as if she had seen a ghost. "Sir, there's a problem," she said, her voice shaky. Mr. Sterling frowned, his mind instantly going into defensive mode. "What now?" he asked dismissively, setting down his cup and preparing for the usual complaints. Policy issues, customers who didn't understand the rules, or maybe some minor grievance that he could easily brush off. The assistant hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure how to break the news. The air between them grew thick with tension. She swallowed hard, as if she was about to say something that would make the floor fall out from beneath him. "Sir, the regional director. She's on her way. And she's not happy," the assistant whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Mr. Sterling's eyes narrowed, irritation flashing across his face. "Let me guess. Some policy complaint?" "Whatever, I'll handle it," he said, brushing it off. He leaned back in his chair, confident that no matter what the issue was, he could handle it with ease. His pride in his position had always been unshakable, until now. But the assistant didn't leave. Instead, she remained standing by the door, her face even paler than before. Her lips trembled slightly as she spoke again, her voice barely audible. "Sir, the regional director. It's the woman you kicked out." A cold silence descended over the office. Mr. Sterling's blood ran cold as the reality of what the assistant was saying settled into his mind. His heart skipped a beat, and his breath caught in his throat. "The woman I kicked out?" he thought. No, it couldn't be. His eyes widened as the pieces fell into place. He had no idea who she really was. The woman, Monica, had been dressed simply, with nothing to hint at her true identity. But now, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to make sense. His dismissal of her, his cruel mocking, the way he had treated her like she didn't belong. It was all about to come crashing down. The assistant's words echoed in his mind, each syllable hitting him like a hammer. The regional director. It's the woman you kicked out. The door to his office opened before he could even respond, and in walked a woman who exuded authority, confidence, and power. She was impeccably dressed, her sharp business attire radiating professionalism. But it wasn't just her appearance that caught Mr. Sterling off guard. It was the unmistakable recognition in her eyes, the same eyes that had once looked at him with disdain as he humiliated her in front of the bank. Monica, the woman he had dismissed as nothing more than a problem earlier that day, now stood before him, her presence commanding the room. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice calm but heavy with authority, "I believe we need to have a conversation." Mr. Sterling's face went white, his earlier confidence evaporating in an instant. He struggled to find his words, stammering as he tried to grasp the situation. I didn't," he began, but Monica held up a hand, silencing him. "No need to explain yourself," she said coldly, her gaze unwavering. "You've already made your position clear." She looked toward the assistant, who had stayed by the door, watching the scene unfold in shock. "Please, have a seat." The assistant nodded silently, stepping aside, her eyes wide with confusion and awe. Monica turned her focus back to Mr. Sterling, her calm demeanor contrasting sharply with his nervous energy. "You thought you could embarrass me today," she said, her voice steady. "But what you didn't know is that I don't just carry the weight of my own story. I carry the weight of my career, my legacy, and now I carry the responsibility of running this bank." Mr. Sterling's face drained of color as he realized who she was. "She's the regional director?" Monica's smile was icy. "I don't take kindly to being humiliated, Mr. Sterling. I'm afraid that's something I don't tolerate in my bank." Her words were like ice, each one cutting through the silence, making it impossible for him to escape the consequences of his actions. She turned to the assistant and nodded. "Please call HR. Mr. Sterling has a few things to discuss with them." The assistant nodded, still processing the shock, and stepped out of the office to make the call. Mr. Sterling was left in the room with Monica, the reality of the situation crashing down on him. He had made the worst mistake of his career, and now he would have to face the consequences of his actions. Monica didn't say another word. She simply stood there, her presence filling the room, making it clear that her words had weight. The man who had treated her with such disdain was now facing the humiliation of his own making. The twist was complete. Mr. Sterling, once so confident, now realized the full extent of his mistake. The woman he had humiliated wasn't just anyone, she was the one in charge, and that would cost him far more than just his position. It would cost him his reputation, his career, and his dignity. Karma, it seemed, had a way of making sure that the ones who inflicted harm would eventually face the consequences. Mr. Sterling's coffee cup shattered as it slipped from his trembling hands, the liquid splattering across his polished desk. He stood frozen, staring at the empty space where his smugness had once lived. His mind raced, struggling to comprehend what was unfolding before him. That's impossible, he stammered, unable to form a coherent thought. His mouth worked, but no words came. He had just learned the devastating truth. Monica, the woman he had belittled and humiliated earlier that day, was no ordinary customer. She wasn't a problem. She was someone he had utterly underestimated, someone far beyond his grasp. As Mr. Sterling stumbled back in shock, the main doors to the office swung open. In walked Monica, now dressed in an elegant, tailored power suit that transformed her entirely. Gone was the humble woman he had judged. The woman standing before him now exuded authority, confidence, and a quiet strength that made his earlier actions feel even more shameful. The bank staff, who had been quietly observing from outside the office, gasped in unison as they recognized her. Their eyes widened, and the whispers began. They were witnessing something that would surely be talked about for years to come. Mr. Sterling had just learned the hard way that appearances can be deceiving. Monica stopped in front of Mr. Sterling's desk, arms crossed, her posture commanding. She stood tall, a stark contrast to the woman he had so carelessly dismissed earlier. The room fell silent, all eyes on her as she spoke, her voice calm, yet undeniably powerful. "We need to talk," Monica said, her tone as firm as steel. Mr. Sterling's heart pounded in his chest. He had thought the worst was over, that he had gotten away with his actions. But now, as he saw the transformation before him, he knew the truth. He had just made an enemy far more powerful than he could ever have imagined. Panicked, Mr. Sterling stumbled to his feet, his face pale with fear. His mind raced as he tried to find the right words, but they caught in his throat. I didn't know. I didn't mean to," he started, but Monica raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "Let me stop you right there," Monica said, her voice calm but sharp. "You had every opportunity to treat me with respect, and you failed." Her words cut through the air, each one a reminder of the power he had carelessly disregarded. Mr. Sterling looked at his assistant, his eyes pleading for some kind of salvation, but there was none. The assistant, pale and shaking, slowly shook their head. They whispered, barely audible, "You're done." The weight of the words hit Mr. Sterling like a freight train. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for, gone, just like that. Monica had given him a chance, more than he deserved, but he had squandered it with his arrogance, his racism, and his contempt for someone he thought was beneath him. He turned back to Monica, but she wasn't looking at him with anger. There was no fire in her eyes, just quiet, unwavering resolve. She had already made her point, and now she was simply watching him fall. The full extent of his mistake was sinking in. He had humiliated the wrong person, and now the consequences were coming in full force. I'm sorry," Mr. Sterling said, his voice shaking. But it was too late. The apology meant nothing now. His words were empty. Monica remained silent, the weight of the situation making her even more powerful in the moment. She had learned long ago that people like Mr. Sterling often only understood one language, the language of consequences. And now he was about to learn the hardest lesson of his life. With a final glance at him, Monica turned and walked out of the office, leaving Mr. Sterling to face the fallout of his own actions. The bank staff, who had witnessed the entire ordeal, began to murmur among themselves. They would never forget what they had seen today. The arrogant man who had tried to push down someone he saw as inferior had just been crushed by the very thing he had overlooked: respect, integrity, and the power of doing what was right. As Monica walked out of the building, her head held high, she knew that the world would soon see the full consequences of Mr. Sterling's actions. Karma had a way of making sure that people like him never got away with cruelty for long. The universe, it seemed, always had a way of balancing the scales, and in this case, the scales had tipped in Monica's favor. Monica stood tall in the middle of the bank, her eyes sweeping over the staff and customers who had witnessed the entire ordeal. There was no more room for hesitation, no more room for tolerating the disrespect she had endured. It was time for accountability, for justice, and it was her moment to make sure it happened. "This bank represents fairness and trust," Monica said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. And yet, the manager was the one violating those values. Her gaze never left Mr. Sterling, who stood in front of her, his face pale with shock. His arrogance, once so palpable, now seemed completely deflated. Monica's eyes hardened, and with a calm, unwavering voice, she delivered the final blow. "Pack your things. You're fired." Mr. Sterling's mouth dropped open in disbelief. His entire world was falling apart in an instant. The facade he had carefully crafted, his authority, his power, was gone. He had no way of stopping what was happening now. "No, please!" he begged, his voice cracking with desperation. "I need this job." But Monica wasn't moved by his pleas. His fate was sealed. Security, now fully under Monica's orders, stepped forward and began escorting Mr. Sterling out of the building. The man who had once been so sure of himself now seemed small, pitiful, as the humiliation continued to unfold. The same customers who had laughed at Monica earlier, who had stood by as she was belittled, now watched in stunned silence as Mr. Sterling was led out. The world was turning, and for the first time, it was turning in Monica's favor. As Monica turned to leave, she caught the eye of a young black teller who had been quietly observing the entire situation. He stood there, pride and gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you for this," he whispered, his voice filled with genuine appreciation. Monica smiled softly, her heart warmed by his words. This was more than just a moment of personal triumph. It was a victory for everyone who had been held down, silenced, or made to feel less than they were. Today, they had all won. Later, Monica sat in her new office, her hands resting gently on the desk. The walls were still bare, but the desk was hers. It was hers because she had earned it. She reached into her bag and carefully placed a photo of her late father on the desk, a man who had worked in banking his entire life and had taught her everything she knew about integrity, fairness, and justice. She gazed at the photo, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. "This is for you, Dad," she whispered softly, her voice filled with emotion. It wasn't just about the victory in the bank today. It was about making sure the values her father had lived by were carried on. Values of fairness, respect, and doing what's right, no matter the obstacles. Justice had been served. And Monica knew that, in this moment, she had truly earned her place in the world.